Moving to a new place is always exciting, isn't it? That's how I felt when we first arrived at Willow Creek. It was like stepping into one of those glossy magazines where everything looks perfect. Neat little houses with matching mailboxes, gardens so tidy they looked fake, and streets so clean you could eat off them. The air smelled fresh, like grass mixed with flowers, and for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. This was going to be our fresh start. Our house wasn't huge or fancy, but it had charm. There was a cozy front porch where I imagined myself sipping coffee in the mornings, watching the sunrise. Inside, boxes were stacked everywhere, waiting to be unpacked, but even amidst the chaos, the space felt warm. Ryan, my husband, was busy setting up shelves in the living room, while Max, our golden retriever, sniffed around every corner like he owned the place. He probably thought he did. I remember standing on the porch that evening, holding a mug of coffee, letting the quiet sink in. Everything seemed peaceful, too peaceful, almost. But I didn't think much of it then. I told myself this was exactly what we needed, a break from the noise and stress of city life, a chance to breathe. 3 days later, reality knocked on our door. Literally. When I opened it, there was no one there, just an envelope lying on the mat. Curious, I picked it up. It was thick and official looking, with the words Willow Creek Homeowners Association printed across the top in bold letters. My heart sank a little as I flipped it open. Inside was a long list of rules. Rules about everything. What color you could paint your house, only shades of beige. How many decorations you could put up during holidays, and when you had to take them down. Even how many lawn ornaments were allowed, 2 max. At first, I laughed. Who cared about stuff like this? It sounded silly, like something out of a comedy movie. But as I kept reading, the laughter faded. Some of these rules weren't just suggestions. They came with warnings, fines, legal action, all because someone decided everyone needed to look the same. Ryan noticed the worried expression on my face when I showed him the letter. "Relax," he said, brushing it off. "We'll follow the rules. No big deal." Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one who loved adding personal touches to our home. To me, these rules felt like handcuffs, chaining us down before we'd even settled in. But I tried not to let it bother me. After all, how bad could it really be? Maybe the HOA was just strict about keeping things nice. Maybe nobody actually enforced these crazy rules. So I shrugged it off and went back to unpacking. Still, something nagged at me. Something about those pages made my stomach twist. Rules are fine, in moderation. But this felt different. It felt like someone was trying to tell me how to live my life before I'd even finished arranging my bookshelf. And deep down, I knew this wouldn't be the last time I heard from the HOA. Little did I know, that envelope was just the beginning. It started with a knock on the door. Not the friendly kind where a neighbor drops by to introduce themselves, but the sharp, impatient kind that makes your heart skip a beat. I opened it to find Mrs. Harper standing there, her perfectly styled hair glinting in the sunlight. She wore oversized sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and her lips were pressed into a thin line that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said in a tone that was anything but warm. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped forward and handed me another envelope. This one felt heavier than the last, like it carried more weight, or maybe it was just my imagination. "You've received a formal warning," she announced, her voice clipped. "Please address the issue promptly." I blinked at her, confused. "What issue?" She gestured vaguely toward my front yard. "Your flower beds contain unauthorized plants. According to Section 12 of the HOA guidelines, only specific species are permitted. You have until Friday to remove them or face a fine of $500. Unauthorized plants. My stomach dropped as I stared at the vibrant purple petunias lining the edge of my garden. They were the first thing I'd planted after moving in, a small act of making this house feel like home. And now they were being labeled as some kind of crime. "But they're just flowers," I stammered, still trying to process what she was saying. They don't hurt anyone. Mrs. Harper tilted her head slightly, as if she pitied me for not understanding. Rules exist for a reason, dear. If we let everyone do whatever they want, this place would lose its charm. Consistency is key. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Charm. Consistency. Was she serious? These weren't weeds or invasive plants. They were cheerful little blooms that brightened up the space. How could something so harmless be considered such a threat? That night, I sat on the couch staring out the window at the offending petunias. Ryan noticed my mood and tried to reassure me. "It's not worth fighting over," he said gently. "Just pull them out and move on. We'll find other ways to make the house feel like ours." But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Those flowers represented more than just decoration. They symbolized freedom. A tiny rebellion against the suffocating rules that seemed determined to strip away any hint of individuality. So I left them there, hoping maybe no one would notice. Spoiler alert. Someone noticed. By Wednesday, a neon orange notice appeared stapled to our gate. It read, "Final warning. Immediate removal required. Non-compliance will result in escalated enforcement measures." The phrase "escalated enforcement measures" sent chills down my spine. What did that even mean? Were they going to send someone to dig up my garden themselves? Or worse, fine us into bankruptcy? The tension grew unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards at night made me jump, convinced someone was lurking outside, ready to vandalize my property. Even Max seemed uneasy, pacing back and forth near the windows instead of curling up for his usual nap. Then came the anonymous notes. At first, they were subtle, slipped under the door or tucked into our mailbox. "Follow the rules," one read. Another simply said, "Conform or leave." Each message was unsigned, but the intent was clear. They'd wanted me to give in, to become like everyone else. I tried ignoring them, telling myself it was all ridiculous, but the hostility seeped into my thoughts, keeping me awake at night. Who were these people, hiding behind vague threats and petty grievances? Why did they care so much about a few flowers? As the days passed, I realized this wasn't just about petunias anymore. It was about power, control, making sure no one stepped out of line. And suddenly, I understood why the neighborhood felt so eerily perfect. It wasn't beauty or charm that kept it that way. It was fear. Fear of punishment. Fear of standing out. And I couldn't decide which scared me more, giving in to their demands or continuing to fight back. The orange notice on our gate felt like a ticking time bomb. Every time I walked past it, my stomach twisted into knots. Escalated enforcement measures. What did that even mean? Were they going to march into my yard with shovels and rip out the flowers themselves? Or maybe slap us with fines so steep we'd have no choice but to leave? The uncertainty gnawed at me, making it hard to focus on anything else. Things escalated quickly after that. The anonymous notes became more frequent and more hostile. One morning, I found a crumpled piece of paper stuffed in our mailbox. "You're ruining this neighborhood. Go back where you came from." Another day, there was a note taped to our front door. "Rules are rules. Stop being selfish." Each message hit harder than the last, not because they were clever or original, but because they were relentless. Someone out there had decided I didn't belong here, and they weren't shy about letting me know. What hurt most wasn't the words themselves. It was the silence from my neighbors. Before all this, I'd waved hello to people walking their dogs or watering their lawns. Now, when I passed them, they avoided eye contact. Some crossed the street to avoid getting too close. Others whispered behind cupped hands as I walked by. It was like I'd been branded an outsider overnight, all because of a few harmless flowers. Even Max seemed to sense the tension. Normally a happy-go-lucky dog who loved everyone, he started barking at shadows and pacing near the windows at night. His unease only added to mine. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every car that slowed down outside our house felt suspicious. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, waiting for me to slip up. Ryan grew increasingly frustrated with the whole situation. "Why are you letting this bother you so much?" he asked one evening, his voice tinged with exasperation. "It's just plants. We can buy new ones later, ones that don't break the rules." "It's not about the plants," I snapped, surprising even myself. "Don't you see? This isn't about flowers or rules or keeping up appearances. It's about control. They want to dictate how we live, what we do, who we are. If I give in now, what's next? Are they going to tell me what color curtains I can hang? What kind of coffee I'm allowed to drink?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I get it, okay. But fighting them isn't going to make things better. It's just going to drag this out longer. For once, can't we just play along?" Play along. Those two words stuck in my throat like a bitter pill. Play along meant giving up, not just the flowers, but everything they represented. Freedom, individuality, the right to carve out a little corner of the world that felt truly ours. And yet, part of me wondered if Ryan was right. Maybe standing my ground wasn't worth the stress, the sleepless nights, the growing rift between us. But then I thought about the alternative, living in constant fear of stepping out of line, tiptoeing around invisible boundaries set by people who didn't care about me or my family. Could I really live like that? Could I raise a child here someday, knowing they'd grow up under the same suffocating weight? One night, unable to sleep, I sat on the porch staring at the petunias bathed in moonlight. Their vibrant purple petals swayed gently in the breeze, defiantly beautiful despite the storm brewing around them. In that moment, I realized something important. Those flowers weren't just plants anymore. They were a symbol, a reminder that sometimes standing your ground matters more than playing it safe. And I knew, deep down, I couldn't let them win. Not yet. It was early Thursday morning when I found the eviction notice. My hands trembled as I pulled it off the front door, the bold black letters glaring up at me like an accusation. Violation of HOA covenant, unauthorized brick driveway. Immediate removal required, or face legal action and potential eviction. I stood there, frozen, reading the words over and over, hoping they'd somehow change. A brick driveway. Really? We hadn't chosen this driveway. It came with the house. And now they were threatening to kick us out over something we didn't even do. My mind raced. This wasn't about bricks or flowers anymore. It was personal. They were coming after me because I refused to back down, because I dared to challenge their rules. But what could I possibly do? Fight them? How? Ryan came outside, his face pale as he read the notice over my shoulder. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Deep down, we both knew better. This wasn't a mistake. It was retaliation. And then it hit me, a memory buried deep in the recesses of my mind. My dad. He owned one of the largest construction companies in the state, and guess who had built half the houses in Willow Creek? His company, including ours. And yes, including that damn brick driveway. A slow smile spread across my face as realization dawned. These people had no idea who they were messing with. The next morning, I marched into the HOA board meeting uninvited. The room fell silent as I entered, all eyes turning to me. Mrs. Harper sat at the head of the table, her usual air of superiority faltering for just a second before she masked it with a tight smile. "Mrs. Carter," she said coolly, "this is a private session." "Oh, I think you'll want to hear what I have to say," I replied, dropping a thick folder onto the table. Inside were copies of contracts, blueprints, and invoices, all signed by my father's company. Every single house in Willow Creek bore his name, including the ones these so-called board members lived in. Their faces went white. One woman coughed nervously. Another whispered, "Is this for real?" "It's very real," I said, leaning forward. "And here's the kicker. Those unauthorized bricks in my driveway. They're part of the original design approved by your precious association 15 years ago. So unless you want me to call my dad and ask him to start inspecting every corner of this neighborhood for code violations. I let the threat hang in the air, watching as panic flickered in their eyes. Mrs. Harper stammered something about needing more time to review the documents, but I could see the fear behind her forced composure. For the first time since moving here, I felt powerful. Like maybe, just maybe, I could take back control of my life. As I walked out of the meeting room, I couldn't help but smile. The tide was finally turning. But I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The HOA might have backed off for now, but they weren't the kind of people to give up easily. Still, for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. Word spread quickly after my little showdown at the HOA meeting. By the next morning, it felt like the entire neighborhood knew what had happened. Some neighbors gave me cautious smiles when they saw me, as if unsure whether to congratulate me or keep their distance. Others glared openly, their disapproval radiating like heat waves on a summer day. Anonymous notes stopped showing up in our mailbox, but that didn't mean the tension disappeared. In fact, it seemed to grow thicker, heavier, like storm clouds gathering overhead. The HOA wasn't done with me, either. They tried to play nice for a while, sending polite reminders about community harmony and urging me to resolve outstanding issues. But beneath the sugary language, their message was clear: back down, or things would get worse. And they weren't wrong. Things did get worse. One night, I woke up to the sound of something scratching against the side of the house. My heart pounded as I crept to the window, peeking through the blinds. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows moving in the moonlight. Then I noticed it. Someone had spray-painted graffiti across our garage door. Big, ugly red letters spelling out, "Leave no." My breath caught in my throat. Ryan stirred beside me, groggy from sleep. When he saw the look on my face, he followed me downstairs. The sight made his jaw tighten. "We should call the police," he said firmly. "No," I replied, shaking my head. "They're testing me. If we involve the cops, they'll deny everything and act innocent. This isn't about justice. It's about power." Ryan wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he grabbed a bucket and some cleaning supplies, and together we scrubbed the paint off the garage door until our hands were raw. It took hours, and by the time we finished, the sun was rising over the horizon. Exhausted but determined, I planted new flowers along the driveway, bright yellow daisies this time. Let them try to find me for those. Despite my defiance, the hostility lingered. Neighbors who used to wave hello now avoided eye contact altogether. One woman reported my recycling bin for being left out too long. Another complained that Max barked during thunderstorms, even though he only barked once before hiding under the bed. Each complaint felt like another jab, another attempt to wear me down. But I refused to let them see me crack. Every morning, I watered my daisies with pride, making sure they bloomed brighter than ever. Every evening, I sat on the porch, sipping tea and pretending not to notice the whispers drifting across the street. Inside, though, the stress was eating away at me. I couldn't sleep without imagining shadowy figures lurking outside. Even Max seemed restless, pacing near the windows instead of curling up for his usual nap. Ryan grew more frustrated with each passing day. "Why are you still fighting this?" he asked one night, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Can't you just let it go?" "Let it go," I repeated, incredulous. "So they can win. So they can prove that anyone who doesn't follow their rules doesn't belong here." "No, I'm not giving them that satisfaction." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I get it, okay. But at what cost? Look at us. We're barely sleeping. We're arguing all the time, and half the neighborhood hates us. Is it really worth it?" His words stung because deep down, I wondered the same thing. Was I fighting for something meaningful, or was I just digging myself deeper into a hole? But every time doubt crept in, I looked at those daisies swaying in the breeze and remembered why I started this fight in the first place. Not for flowers or dragways or even revenge, but for the right to live life on my own terms. And then came the annual HOA Summer Barbecue, a mandatory event designed to foster community spirit. As much as I hated the idea, I knew skipping it would only fuel their vendetta. So I plastered on a fake smile, grabbed a plate of potato salad, and mingled. Mrs. Harper spotted me immediately. She marched over, flanked by 2 other board members. "Enjoying yourself, Mrs. Carter?" she asked sweetly, though her eyes were cold. "As much as anyone can enjoy being micromanaged," I shot back. Her smile faltered. "You've caused quite a stir around here. People are uncomfortable. And yet somehow my driveway still exists," I said lightly, taking a sip of lemonade. "Funny how that works." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Heads turned as a man strode into the party. Tall, commanding, unmistakably my father. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Isn't that the guy who built this place?" Dad walked straight up to Mrs. Harper, shaking her hand firmly. "Lovely neighborhood you've got here," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Shame if anything happened to it. The barbecue felt different after that. For the first time in months, I could actually relax, at least a little. Mrs. Harper didn't return to the party, and her absence seemed to loosen the tension in the air. Neighbors who had been avoiding me for weeks suddenly found their courage to approach. Some offered awkward apologies. Others just gave polite nods, as if testing the waters. It was strange, watching people's attitudes shift so quickly. One moment, they were treating me like an outcast, and the next, they acted like nothing had happened. But I wasn't fooled. This wasn't about forgiveness or second chances. It was about fear. Fear of my dad, fear of losing control, fear of what might happen if they pushed too hard. Still, I decided to take the small victory where I could find it. If they wanted to pretend everything was fine now, so be it. At least the hostility stopped, for a while. Things calmed down around the neighborhood. The anonymous notes disappeared completely, and no one complained about Max barking anymore. Even the graffiti stayed away. On the surface, life at Willow Creek seemed almost normal. But beneath the quiet facade, I knew the HOA hadn't given up. They were just regrouping, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under our door like all the others. At first glance, it looked harmless enough. A plain white envelope with the HOA logo stamped neatly in the corner. But when I opened it, my stomach sank. Inside was a formal notice. Request for mandatory compliance inspection. Scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. "What does that even mean?" Ryan asked, frowning as he read over my shoulder. "It means they're coming here to dig up dirt," I said grimly. "They'll comb through every inch of this house, looking for anything that violates their precious rules. And trust me, they'll find something." Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "So what do we do? Clean the place spotless? Hide the daisies?" I shook my head. "No, we don't hide anything. Let them come. Let them see exactly who they're dealing with." Friday morning arrived faster than I expected. By 9:45, I was standing on the porch, arms crossed, waiting. Sure enough, at precisely 10 o'clock, a sleek black car pulled into our driveway. Out stepped Mrs. Harper, flanked by 2 inspectors carrying clipboards and measuring tapes. She wore her usual polished smile, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," she said brightly. "We're here for the inspection. I hope you don't mind." "Not at all," I replied, stepping aside to let them in. "Make yourselves comfortable." For the next 2 hours, they poked and prodded every corner of our home. They measured the height of our hedges, checked the color of our curtains, even inspected the brand of light bulbs we used. Every minor infraction was noted with smug satisfaction. "These throw pillows aren't on the approved fabric list," one inspector announced, holding up a cushion like it was evidence of a crime. "And your mailbox is half an inch too tall," added the other. Mrs. Harper watched silently, her lips curling into a faint smirk. Clearly, she thought she'd won. When they finally finished, she handed me a thick stack of papers detailing every violation and the corresponding fines. "You have 30 days to address these issues," she said sweetly. "Failure to comply will result in further action." I glanced at the list, then back at her. "You really think this is going to work?" Her smile faltered. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, leaning forward slightly, "you've already tried everything else. Fines, warnings, threats, vandalism. None of it worked. What makes you think this will?" Her face flushed, but she recovered quickly. "This isn't personal, Mrs. Carter. It's about maintaining standards." "No," I corrected her. "It's about power. Control. Making sure no one steps out of line. But guess what? You picked the wrong person to mess with." She stared at me, speechless, as I walked back inside and closed the door behind me. Through the window, I watched them leave, their shoulders stiff with frustration. Later that night, I sat on the porch with Ryan, staring at the daisies glowing softly in the moonlight. "Do you think they'll ever stop?" he asked quietly. "Probably not," I admitted. "But that's okay. Because no matter what they throw at us, we're not backing down." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The HOA didn't stop, of course. They couldn't, not without losing face. But something had shifted after the inspection. Their tactics became quieter, sneakier, like they were trying to chip away at me instead of launching a full-on attack. Complaints trickled in more sporadically. "Your porch light is too bright." The daisies are technically considered unapproved vegetation. Each one felt less threatening and more desperate, like they were grasping at straws. I handled it all with a calm I didn't know I had. Every notice went straight into the trash. Every complaint was met with silence, or sometimes a polite smile when I passed the neighbor who'd filed it. Let them stew in their frustration. I wasn't about to let them see me sweat anymore. Ryan noticed the change in me too. "You seem lighter," he said one evening as we sat on the porch watching Max chase fireflies. "I am," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "I've realized something important. They can fine us, inspect us, complain about us, but they can't take away what matters most. Our home, our family, who we are." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Does that mean you're done fighting?" "Not exactly," I said with a small grin. "It means I'm done letting them win." A few weeks later, another neighborhood meeting was called. This time, attendance was mandatory for all homeowners. When Ryan and I walked into the community center, whispers rippled through the room. Some people avoided eye contact. Others gave hesitant smiles. Mrs. Harper stood at the front, shuffling papers nervously. She looked older somehow, her usual confidence replaced by something closer to exhaustion. When everyone was seated, she cleared her throat and began speaking. "As you know, maintaining the integrity of Willow Creek has always been our priority. However, recent events have highlighted areas where we may need to reassess certain policies." My ears perked up. Reassess. That was new. She continued, her voice wavering slightly. "Effective immediately, some guidelines will be relaxed to allow for greater personal expression within reasonable limits. For example, approved plant species will now include a wider variety of flowers." A murmur ran through the crowd. People exchanged surprised glances. Even I raised an eyebrow. Was this really happening? Mrs. Harper pressed on, avoiding my gaze. "Additionally, fines for minor infractions will be reduced, and enforcement measures will focus on safety concerns rather than aesthetic uniformity." By the end of her speech, the room buzzed with quiet excitement. Neighbors whispered to each other, nodding approvingly. It seemed the HOA's iron grip was finally loosening, and everyone knew why. After the meeting, several people approached me. One woman apologized for how things had escalated. Another thanked me for standing up to the board. Even Mr. Peterson, the grumpy man from 3 doors down, gave me a curt nod and muttered, "Good job." That night, As I watered the daisies under the soft glow of the porch light, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The battle wasn't completely over, but it didn't matter anymore. I'd proven something to myself, that standing your ground doesn't always mean winning. Sometimes, it just means refusing to lose. Ryan joined me outside, handing me a cup of tea. "So," he said with a smirk, "what's next? Are you going to repaint the house neon green just to test them?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Nope. I think I've made my point. Besides, I kind of like it beige." We both chuckled, the sound mingling with the chirping crickets and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. For the first time since moving to Willow Creek, I felt like I truly belonged, not because I fit in, but because I'd carved out a space that was authentically mine.